Amid an ongoing Ukrainian cross-border attack, Russian border region Kursk has announced a state of emergency. The acting governor of Kursk, Alexei Smirnov, announced the emergency via telegram, did not elaborate on the measures that this would entail. Reports suggest that intense battle is underway along the borders. Ukrainian forces have pushed to the northwest of the border town of Tsudza, the last operational trans-shipping point of Russian natural gas to Europe. To discuss the situation, we now have with us Ben Aris, founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews, and also former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph. So thank you so much for joining us on WION.
Pleased to be here.
Sir, how do you assess this attack by the Ukrainian forces? What do you think is the aim here?
Well, everyone's discussing exactly that point. It's not quite clear what the goal is here, and there are several options in play. First is to note that this is the first time the Ukrainians have actually, quote-unquote, invaded Russia, crossed into Russian territory proper, and are attacking the region on the border. And that's already unsettled the State Department because they're afraid of this escalation. And by taking the fight into Russia, then it could be always in the background was the idea that the NATO was supporting Ukraine, but now it can be interpreted NATO is attacking Russia by going into its own territory. But as I say, the military goals are not clear. It's going to be very hard to hold this territory, and the Ukrainian armed forces have already captured an estimated 350 square kilometers, which is the biggest gain in territory by either side since the spectacular Kharkiv offensive in 2022, when again the Ukrainians smashed through the Russian lines and took back hundreds of kilometers of territory. And as I say, Zelensky's been talking about holding a second peace summit in November, so I think probably the most likely scenario is that because Putin at that summit is likely to demand that Russia keeps the territories it's occupied, 4 regions and the land bridge and the Donbass, that Kiev is trying to get itself a territorial card to play in those negotiations, and so that they got something to trade in order to get back some of the regions they've lost to the Russian forces, if they can hold this territory for 2 months until November when those talks are supposed to happen.
Right, sir. Now, just for better understanding here, the United States says that Ukraine is not in violation of the rules on use of U.S. weapons in Russian territory. That being said, we do know that Ukrainian forces are outnumbered. It can't match Russia's arsenal of weapons either. Do you think Ukraine can sustain this attack on its own?
Well, that's what I was saying. I mean, the problem is the Russian machine, the Russian army is bigger and at this point better equipped than the Ukrainian army. So they can't keep this up. I think there's a huge question mark over how long they can hold this territory. They caught the Russians with their trousers down. This was a surprise attack, and they've gone through the region like a knife through butter because it's not particularly fortified. And they can't hold these towns because they're not fortified. I mean, the defenses on the Ukrainian side of the border, they've built defenses so they can, where they're facing an assault by the Russian forces along the line and are being pushed back. And now they've taken this Russian territory. They haven't got time to build effective defenses. And so Russia will then, reorganize its army, gather some reserves, and then start a counteroffensive in this region. That will be pretty hard. Pretty hard to repulse. But as I say, if we're working on the theory that this is just a territorial card ahead of the November negotiations, then they only have to hold it for 2 months, which they can probably do.
All right. I was in fact going to come to you about Russia's response to this, which you have said that this area is not necessarily heavily fortified or wasn't until now. That being said, this is perhaps the biggest escalation in the war in months. Do you see the two sides negotiating peace anytime soon? Or do you think what happens in the United States in the November elections, that will have a bigger bearing on how things pan out on that front?
Yes, of course, November and the possibility of Trump coming in as the next president is a complete wild card. He said repeatedly that he will, quote unquote, end the war in a day. Nobody knows quite what that means or if it's even possible. But then both sides, both Zelensky and Putin, have made it very clear that they're willing to talk. And I think the November elections are playing less of a role now, because, I mean, there's a Ukraine fatigue amongst the Western allies. The trouble that Ukraine had getting that $61 billion aid package out of the States at the beginning of this year suggests that that was the last big package. So from Zelensky's point of view, he can fight another year, but after that the aid will fade away, and without that support money and weapons, his prospects are very bleak. But on the Russian side too, the pain of the war, while Putin has put the economy on a war footing, the pain on the Russian economy is growing slowly, and this is not sustainable for Putin either in the long term. I mean, he has the upper hand, he has the initiative, he has more resources, so he can easily keep this up for another couple of years. But I think, given the fatigue on all sides, this is an opportune moment. And both sides have said, let's talk peace. Zelensky explicitly is working on a second peace summit. He's called for a referendum by the people to vote on the idea of conceding some territory to Russia, which is a necessary part of the talks. And Putin himself also offered a ceasefire on the eve of the Swiss peace summit that was in July, and said, let's pick up again from the Istanbul deal that was done right at the first month and agreed by both sides, Russia and Ukraine. So there is a framework already ready to roll out. But the question of captured territory is the key part of those negotiations, and that's going to be very difficult, which again suggests that this Kursk battle is part of that. It's a territorial card that Ukraine needs going into those talks in order to recapture or retake or control of some of the territories lost.
All right. Well, Mr. Ayres, thank you so much for joining us on WION World as One with your insights on this. Always a pleasure having you with us.
Pleasure.
For latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.